Hey everybody, welcome back. Another episode of the Power Baseball League coming at you. And so today we're going to dive into the world of relationships, which is something that, as Kylie and I were talking about, things we could cover in this series and what we could deal with not only from an information perspective, but also important to the project that we're working on. Relationships was one of those things that came up that we were like, people often overlook them, and it's not so much they overlook the fact that there are relationships in the system, but there's all these little things that you can do with them and control about them that I think sometimes get overlooked. So we thought it might make a good topic to bring into the fold here, and we're going to give you a couple of quick high-level examples, and if you're not familiar with some of these, then hopefully this will give you some information to dive in and like we talk about all the time, take out a trial and start playing around a little bit and just understand what you can and can't do when it comes to relationships between entities, or tables, should I say.
Yeah, and I was just thinking back at the beginning of the whole series, we talked a lot about our relationships when we were drawing out our diagrams, and we were talking about the one to many, many to many. We were talking about those relationships, but we weren't talking too much about the behavior, which is kind of what we wanted to touch on today. So let me quickly share my screen. All right, so here we are, we're within our solution, and I just want to go into the contact entity, and we're going to look at some of the relationships there. So your relationships get automatically created when you are building a lookup or something like that, and you can see them over here on the relationships tab. One quick thing to remember is up here it has the default, so we're looking at whichever ones they think we care about, but you can also switch this list to see all, to see some of the out-of-the-box relationships that exist on contact. We'll go back to our default list to kind of shrink that down a little bit. So let's talk about the primary caregiver. So this was a lookup that we created on the contact to link our contact to their parent, right? And if we look at that, we can see it shows the name, it shows us the field that we're using, and it shows us that it's an N-to-1, right? One parent can have many children, or one caregiver can have many children. But the important bit we want to talk about is this type of behavior. So this was created as a referential, meaning that we're linked together with that record, but our behavior doesn't necessarily depend on it. But the important thing with that is this delete to remove link, right? So you can choose how you want that delete behavior to mean. So a lot of documentation around this talks about that cascading behavior, right? So it means when I do something to the parent, do I care about what's happening to the children, right? So if I say remove link, then what's going to happen is if I delete the parent, then those children will exist and just be orphaned records. And this is really kind of a horrible way to talk about it, since we're actually talking about parents and children, but it'll be that record would just be removed from that lookup field, right? And then our alternative is to restrict, meaning that I couldn't delete that parent record unless the children had already been deleted. But I have other types of behavior, and it's really important to understand these. If I have parental behavior, that basically means that everything that happens to the parent flows down to the children. And it's important to keep that in mind about deletion and also about sharing. That's a big thing, because if you're using sharing a lot, then all these little shares that you can't see anywhere get created behind the scenes if that sharing is cascading.
We should call out quickly too that just to clarify that it doesn't mean that if you change a record or a field on that form, so if you change a record on the parent account, the phone number, for example, it's not going to necessarily change. We're talking about actions against that record. So like I was talking about the sharing, or if you assign a record, then those records will go over. So the child record will be assigned to whoever you assign the parent one as well. So it's the actions on the record.
Yeah, that's a great call out. And I think it's a little bit easier to see when you're doing a custom, because it shows you what behavior you're choosing from, right? So we're talking about our assignment, and you can choose if you cascade it, cascade active, this is really interesting. Like when we think about say an account with their activities. What do you want to happen when I reassign an account? Should the person who had an open phone call still have that phone call, or do you automatically want it reassigned, or do you want some of them reassigned, right? So that's when you want to think about these behaviors. So really, we encourage you whenever you have relationships in your system that you go in and take a look and see, do these make sense? Especially this delete one. You probably either want to restrict it or remove the link. And also your sharing, do we want to get rid of that? Usually I'd recommend cascading none, but quick reminder, sharing shouldn't be the basis for your security model. So hopefully that doesn't matter anyways. But there was one other cool thing I wanted to show you about relationships quickly, which is related to mapping. So you'll see I popped over into the Classic Solution Explorer because the mapping is currently only visible right there. But basically what our mapping allows us to do is allows us on the create of the record to get data from that related record. So like Malcolm was saying, we're not cascading data changes from one record to the other, but we do have the ability to map that data initially on the create. So it doesn't stay in sync, but it just kind of helps with that initial data entry. So one thing that we were talking about is probably our email, right? A lot of these kids that we're working with could be younger and they might not have their own email. So it probably makes sense to cascade or to map the parent's email to the child's email when we're creating them, right? Yeah. So we're going to open up our primary caregiver here. And you'll see that we have our mappings on the left-hand side. And we can go down here and click a new mapping, and we're just going to add our email. So we get the list of the source and the target. In this case, these are both contact records. So it's really easy to choose that field, but you could do this in other ways too, right? If you had two entities that had fields that did the same thing, but are called something different because they're on different, maybe a custom entity and a system entity, you could still map those together as long as they're the same type of field, right?
Yep, good call.
Let's go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to save this and publish. What else do we have to talk about while that's publishing? What other tips do you have for people?
I think those are the big ones. This is a really important one because when you think about entering data, especially, right? So if you have, and I've been in scenarios where we're going to create an account and then we're going to add a bunch of contacts in, and we know that the contacts should just take the business phone or the address of the account right out of the gate because we know that these people work there. This saves a ton of time when your mappings are set up properly because you don't have to rekey all that same data. You go in, you create the account, you go to the contact section, you say create new, and it's just going to pull that information. And Kylie's going to show you that right now. When we create a contact from a child contact from our parent record, as in our baseball example, that's the way it's sort of structured, you're going to see that information get pulled over right away, which is really handy.
Yeah. So if we see here, this is one of our caregiver contacts, and we can go related contacts and see the children they already have in the system. And then if we click new contact, you'll see that our primary caregiver was already populated, and there is our email getting populated as well from the parent. And you'll see we have other fields that are being populated because you may have noticed there were already some mappings listed on our primary caregiver, right? And so let's just call this, right? And if I save, Peter doesn't have a job title. Well, no need to talk about that.
It's likely a topic for another time. Yeah.
Exactly. So you'll see we made that update there. But then again, if I went here and say maybe he has changed his email, if I make that update, come on, buddy. If I make that update to the parent's email, and when I look at the contacts, that update isn't made because it's not a sync, but it's just a kind of one-time mapping when you get started to help with your data entry.
Yeah, that's a good example to show because that would be really cool. And you can create some flow or Power Automate workflows even to do some of that work. Say, hey, if this, I've seen in the past where you have a workflow. We'll talk in the older system where we just use workflow, where you have a button set up that says, same as parent, and if that's checked, it'll grab all the data from the parent account or the parent record or whatever the structure is and pull all that over. But that's not an out of the box function. You have to build that in. So.
Right. Yep, definitely done those similar kind of things. It's always an adventure when you're trying to keep your data in sync between two records. And the other thing to keep in mind that's cool, which I don't think we talked about too much, is things like quick view entities, right? So one thing to think about is, do I want to be mapping this data, or should I instead just be showing data from the parent or something like that? Yeah. If it's something to help you with quick data entry, that's great. But if it's something you're going to have to worry about and maintain long term, then maybe find a different solution. Yeah.
Do you really need this information on the, taking up space on the form or on the field, not on the form rather, but in the system? Do you really need that data on that contact record, or do you just need to see it? That's a huge, and a lot of times I've seen conversations unfold where a lot of times when they kind of sit back and think about that, and they're like, hey, you're right. I just want to see what it is. I don't want to have to pull it in. And quick view forms have been a great invention for that, to tackle that, because a lot of times you did just want to see it, but the only way to see it was to pull it or to click the record and go, and then you're navigating back and forth. And if you have users in your organization, I'm sure you've heard them say, there's too many clicks. I don't want to click through this and through that, and which is totally fair. I get it. They're trying to do an efficient job day to day, and when you got to click this record and bounce back and forth and go back, and it's a pain for them. So if you can expedite that experience a little bit with using a quick view form instead of pulling data over, that's great. So perhaps something we can dive into more detail in another call.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. I hope this has been beneficial for you, and we'll see you next week.